The great tea convoys of the Qing Dynasty awake before dawn in the early 18th century. In a dusty market town on the southern edge of Mongolia, the air is cold enough to make your breath visible, but there is already movement in the narrow streets, not the noise of merchants shouting, but the steady creak of leather straps and the low grumble of camels preparing to walk for weeks. This is the morning of departure for one of the Qing Dynasty's great tea convoys, a slow-moving river of trade and patience. These convoys were not the kind of trade mission that drew royal attention or chroniclers' flourishes. There were no grand ceremonies. The significance lay instead in their steadiness, year after year. They connected the tea-growing hills of China's south with the steppe markets of the north and, eventually, the palaces of Russia. Their pace was deliberate, their rhythm dictated not by the clock, but by the condition of the animals and the weight of the cargo. Tea, in this context, was not just a drink. In the northern reaches of the Qing Empire, especially among the nomadic peoples of Inner Asia, tea was an essential daily commodity, boiled into bricks of buttered, salted brew. It was fuel as much as flavor. The convoys that carried it were therefore not simply moving a luxury good. They were carrying warmth, energy, and a small form of stability across some of the harshest climates on Earth. The first step in this journey began far from the cold plains down in the warm, mist-covered hills of Fujian or Sichuan. There the tea was grown, picked, and processed into compressed bricks or wheels. This form was more than tradition. It was a necessity. Loose, leaf tea would have been too fragile and too bulky to survive the long overland trek. Compressed tea, on the other hand, could be stacked tightly, handled repeatedly, and still arrive intact after thousands of miles. From the tea hills, the bricks traveled to the imperial warehouses, where officials recorded their weight and quality. The bureaucratic process was slow and thorough. Each batch was inspected, its origin noted, and its intended destination written in the clear, deliberate hand of a Qing scribe. Once entered into the ledger, the bricks were packed into bales, tied with reed or hemp rope, and loaded onto the backs of waiting camels. The convoy itself was a study in calculated order. A typical tea caravan might consist of several hundred camels arranged in long, patient lines. Each animal carried a standard load, balanced to avoid injury over the long march. The lead animals wore bells, their tones distinctive enough that experienced handlers could recognize the sound of their pone convoy in the distance. These bells did not serve to announce arrival so much as to keep the rhythm of the march and maintain contact in dust storms or snowfall. Camels were not chosen for speed, but for endurance. Their slow, rolling gait was perfectly matched to the needs of the trade. They could travel for hours without tiring, go days without water, and withstand the wide temperature swings of the route from humid valleys to icy passes. Their handlers, often drawn from nomadic groups along the trade corridor, walked beside them, occasionally riding for short stretches, but more often moving on foot, boots crunching in time with the padded steps of their animals. The route from The southern warehouses to the northern markets was long and varied. It crossed rivers, skirted deserts, and climbed through mountain passes where the air thinned and the wind cut like glass. At each stop, the convoy rested in way stations, compounds with high walls to keep out the wind and opportunistic thieves. Here, the camels were watered, their loads checked, and the ropes tightened. Tea bales that had shifted were repacked, their edges brushed free of dust. The convoy did not rush. A day's travel might be no more than 30 kilometers, sometimes less if the terrain was difficult. The pace allowed for careful management of the animals and ensured that the goods arrived in saleable condition. Speed was the enemy of this trade. A damaged tea brick could lose value, and a dead camel could delay the entire line. At night, the convoy camped in a rough circle, the camels kneeling to rest, while their handlers boiled water for tea, a small portion taken from the cargo or brought separately for the journey. This evening ritual was more than refreshment. It was a reminder of the commodity's value. To drink it under the cold stars was to understand why people in distant lands would wait months for its arrival. The early stages of the route were often the easiest. The land was greener, the air thicker, and supplies more plentiful. It was further north, past the Great Wall, and into the open steppe that the real test began. Here, the wind could carry sand or snow with equal force, and the distances between reliable water sources stretched to the patience of even the most seasoned handler. Still, the convoy moved forward, guided by men who knew every rise in the land and every hollow where snow might drift. This entire network functioned not through a single imperial command, but through a web of agreements between tea merchants, camel owners, way station keepers, and border officials. It was a chain of obligations, each link aware that delay or failure would ripple outward. This was why the departure morning was so calm. Every participant knew their role, and every step of the journey had been rehearsed countless times over. Generations. And so, with the camels stepping into the first leg of their long march, and the handlers settling into the rhythm of the road, the leaves began their journey northward. They would pass through lands where the language changed, the clothing changed, and even the cooking of tea took on new flavors. Yet the bricks themselves would remain constant, silent, unchanging witnesses to the vast, slow movement of trade. Still, there is a lingering question, as the first week of the convoy passes without incident. What unseen challenges will the road bring once the convoy enters the open steppe, where the land offers no shelter and the wind holds no mercy? By the time the convoy crossed the invisible border into the northern steppe, the road, as most people would imagine it, had disappeared entirely. There were no stone markers, no carved milestones, no lines of trees. The land opened into a pale, rolling plain, stretching so far that the horizon seemed less like a line and more like a slow fade into the sky. Here, the tea convoy entered a different kind of space, one that tested endurance not by obstacles, but by monotony. For days, the ground beneath the camels' feet barely changed. Sparse tufts of grass bent in the wind, and the earth was a muted patchwork of dust and frost. To walk across the steppe was to feel the slow pace of time itself. You could look at the same ridge for half a day before reaching it, and when you did, it offered only another ridge beyond. The handlers knew how to measure progress in this kind of landscape. They counted the march not by the number of hours walked, but by the spacing of wells and the angle of the sun. Some wells were natural springs, others hand-dug pits lined with stones, and each one marked the invisible threads of old trade paths that had existed long before the Qing organized their convoys. These stops were both relief and risk. While they gave the camels a much-needed drink, they also made the convoy visible to anyone watching from a distance. This far north, banditry was less about dramatic ambushes and more about quiet calculation. A small group of mounted raiders might shadow the convoy for days, waiting for a moment when the camels were scattered or the handlers distracted. To deter such attempts, convoys traveled in tight formation, with experienced guards spaced along the length of the line. Most of the guards were not soldiers in the imperial sense, but men hired for their knowledge of the land and their skill with a bow or matchlock. They preferred to avoid confrontation entirely, and often a simple displacer, as riding out with visible weapons was enough to persuade opportunists to look elsewhere. The daily routine remained steady. At dawn, the camels were loaded, each bale of tea checked and balanced. The handlers moved with practiced economy, tightening knots, adjusting harnesses, testing the straps for wear. A camel could not simply be overloaded to make up for a lost pack animal. Too much weight, and the creature's endurance would falter within days. The convoy's success depended on the unspoken agreement between man and beasts that neither would be pushed beyond their limit without cause. Meals on the steppe were plain but practical. Dried mutton, hard bread, and tea boiled in large kettles with salt and sometimes milk. This tea was not a delicate infusion to be sipped. It was fuel, thick and sustaining, meant to warm the body and steady the mind against the wind. When the kettles came off the fire, the warmth carried through the night. Long after the flames had cooled to embers, weather was both ally and enemy. A clear day meant steady progress, but also exposure to wind that could whip across the plain without warning. Clouds often moved faster than the camels, and a sunny morning could become a snow-laden afternoon in the space of an hour. Handlers wrapped themselves in layers of felt and wool, adjusting constantly to keep sweat from freezing against their skin. The camels, for their part, simply pressed forward, their thick coats catching flecks of ice and snow. Night on the steppe was a quiet, deliberate affair. The camels were tied in groups to prevent them from wandering, their loads covered against frost. Guards took turns walking the perimeter, listening for anything unusual. In the distance, the cries of wolves were not uncommon, though they rarely approached a full convoy. The greater threat was the cold itself, which could creep into the bones and slow a man's movements without him noticing until his fingers no longer obeyed his thoughts. Even with the precautions, some journeys were interrupted by loss. A camel might go lame, forcing the load to be redistributed. A bale might be damaged in a fall, its tea exposed to the damp and losing value with every hour. These setbacks were absorbed into the rhythm of the march. No single problem was large enough to stop the convoy, but each demanded careful adjustment to avoid cascading into greater trouble along the way. The convoy passed through small encampment yurts clustered near a water source, smoke rising from dung-fed fires. Here, the convoy sometimes traded minor goods or hired local guides to navigate difficult stretches. In return, the locals received tea bricks, which they might keep for their own use or sell in distant markets. The exchange was quiet, conducted with nods and short phrases. Both sides understood the importance of conserving words in a land where the wind carried them away. One of the most challenging sections of the route came midway across the steppe, a region where wells were scarce and the ground was broken by shallow ravines. These ravines, often invisible until you were upon them, could force the convoy to detour for hours, adding strain to the animals and increasing the risk of separation. In such places, the lead handlers relied not on maps, but on maps passed down from those who had walked the route before. It was during one of these stretches that an early season snowstorm swept across the convoy. The wind rose in the late afternoon, carrying with it the fine, dry snow that could sting by the skin like sand. Visibility dropped to a few dozen paces, and the bells on the lead camels became the only guide for those behind. Handlers moved closer together, speaking little, conserving energy for the slow push toward the next sheltering rise in the land. When the convoy finally reached a shallow basin that offered some protection from the wind, the camels were unloaded quickly. Fires were lit, and the handlers huddled close, their faces half hidden in scarves. The tea brewed that night was stronger than usual, salted heavily to replace what the body lost to cold and exertion. In the silence between gusts, the storm's hiss became the only sound until, at some unknown hour, it simply stopped. The next morning revealed a transformed landscape. The steppe lay under a sheet of white, broken only by the dark humps of camels and the lines of their breath. The convoy moved on, slower now, the snow crunching underfoot. Each step forward brought them closer to the markets of Kayakta. But the road ahead remained long dot, and somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible for now, lay the border itself, line that was both a meeting place and a point of negotiation. The Qing convoy would not simply roll into Russian territory without formality. But what exactly awaited them at that crossing? Would it be a smooth handover, or a drawn-out test of patience between two empires? The final stretch toward the Russian border at Kayakta was unlike the long, open plains that had dominated the journey so far. Here, the steppe began to fold into low hills, and with each passing day, the signs of human habitation grew more frequent. You could smell the faint scent of wood smoke before you could see the clusters of huts and trading posts. Roads, or at least well-worn tracks, began to appear again, some lined with low fences. others traced by wheel ruts half filled with snow or mud. For the convoy handlers, this was a moment of both relief and heightened awareness. Relief because the weeks of empty land were giving way to signs of the journey's end. Awareness because here, at the edge of the Qing Empire, every movement was watched. Russian patrols did not usually trouble the convoys before the official crossing, but scouts and interpreters often appeared on the horizon, noting the size, composition, and condition of the caravan. Kyakhta itself was a place that existed almost entirely for the purpose of trade. Founded in the early 18th century to formalize commerce between the Qing and the Russian empires, it was more an arrangement than a city to parallel settlements facing each other across the border. On the Russian side, Maymaking on the Qing side. In between stood a carefully patrolled strip of land, where transactions were negotiated under the watch of both governments. The tea convoy's arrival was not a sudden event. It was preceded by a series of smaller steps. First, the inspection by Qing officials at the last outpost. Then the slow reorganization of the loads, so that each bale could be easily counted. Then the arrangement of the convoy into the proper order for presentation. Bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and no matter how far the convoy had traveled, the final leg could take as long as the roughest days on the steppe. The Russian inspectors were equally deliberate. They arrived with ledgers and scales, sometimes accompanied by translators who spoke just enough Mandarin or Mongolian to make the process efficient, though not so efficient as to feel hurried. Tea bricks were weighed, examined for signs of damage or adulteration, and sorted according to grade. The higher the quality, the more exacting the scrutiny. Any suspicion of moisture, mold, or substitution could lead to hours of discussion, and the handlers knew better than to object. The goods, after all, had been sent not just to trade, but to uphold the reputation of Qing tea in Russian markets. While the officials worked, the guards and camel handlers waited. Some took the opportunity to rest in the shelter of nearby inns, where the smell of bread ovens mixed with the unfamiliar aroma of Russian soups and stews. Others stayed near the convoy, keeping an eye on the animals and the cargo. For the camels, this was a moment of transition, too. Many would not make the return journey. Instead, they would be sold locally, either for use in other caravans or to supply meat and hides to nearby settlements. A few, especially the strongest and most even-tempered, might be bought by Russian traders to carry goods deeper into Siberia. The negotiation over prices was a slow dance. Tea was valued in Russia as both a luxury and a daily necessity among the wealthy classes, but the Russians were keen to press for favorable terms. The Qing traders, for their part, understood that even a small price shift could mean the difference between profit and loss across the entire convoy. Every word mattered, and sometimes a day's bargaining produced only an agreement to meet again the next morning. Behind the trade, there were always the quieter exchanges, gifts, tokens of goodwill, subtle reminders of past cooperation. bolt of fine silk might find its way into the hands of a Russian official's family. A small barrel of vodka might be sent as a sample to the Qing side. These gestures smoothed the edges of formal diplomacy, even if they never appeared in the official records. When the final agreement was reached, the process of unloading began in earnest. Tea bricks were transferred from camel to cart, packed for the long journey into the heart of Russia. Some would travel to Irkutsk, others all the way to Moscow or St. Petersburg. In time, these bricks would be brewed in samovars, in city drawing rooms, on river barges, and in remote Siberian cabins, each cup carrying with it a trace of the long road from the tea fields of Yunnan, through mountain passes, across the frozen steppe, and into the markets of a foreign empire. For the handlers, the conclusion was less about ceremony and more about routine. Empty saddles were checked, harnesses repaired for the return trip. Those who had completed their contracted service prepared to go home, while others signed on for the next journey. The steppe waited, as patient and unchanging as it had been on the way out. And yet, for all the predictability of the convoy's return, there lingered a quiet uncertainty. Each trip carried its own set of hazard storms, disputes, illness among the camels, or shifts in imperial policy that could close the route entirely. No one could say with certainty what the next year's tea trade would bring, only that it would begin again in much the same way, with the loading of bricks, the tightening of straps, and the first measured steps away from the tea markets and toward the horizon, as the last cart creaked away toward the Russian side. The emptying yard of Maymaking echoed briefly with the sound of bells fewer, now lighter. The caravan diminished. The handlers turned their faces south, toward the long road home, and you might wonder, standing at that quiet border, how many cups of tea in distant drawing rooms would still carry, in their heat and aroma, the memory of the wind over the steppe. The salt pans of ancient Ethiopia were to rise before dawn in the Afar Depression, the air still cool enough to breathe without strain. You would see a strange and endless white surface stretching toward the horizon. It is not snow, though. The brightness under a morning sun can be blinding but salt. For millennia, this inhospitable region of northeastern Africa has been both feared for its heat and revered for its wealth. Salt here was not simply a seasoning. It was a currency, a tool of trade, and the quiet foundation of entire economies. The Danakil Depression, part of the Afar Triangle, sits more than 100 meters below sea level, hemmed in by jagged volcanic hills and rift valleys that hint at the slow tearing apart of the African continent. To an outsider, it might seem an impossible place for human activity, but for the Afar people, it is both workplace and lifeline. Every few days, caravans of camels, donkeys, and their handlers descend onto the salt flats to harvest the mineral wealth left behind by retreating ancient seas. The work begins with the first light of day. A few hours later, the sun will turn, the air heavy and metallic, and the ground will shimmer with heat. So the quarrymen, men whose fathers and grandfathers did the same work walk, barefoot or in worn sandals, onto the salt pan, carrying long iron bars and wooden wedges. Their movements are measured, unhurried, not out of laziness, but out of the careful pacing learned over generations. First comes the sounding, slow, deliberate tapping along the ground to locate the clearest and cleanest salt layer. Then the cutting begins. Iron bars driven into the crust loosen sheets of salt that are pried up in long slabs. The salt here is dense, almost stone-like, and splitting it cleanly requires both strength and a practiced eye. Once freed, each slab is trimmed into a neat rectangular block, typically about the size of a large loaf of bread. These are known as umol, and for centuries they have served not only as a trade good, but as a form of currency across parts of Ethiopia. The blocks are stacked in neat rows, their edges drying under the sun as the men continue their work. Conversations pass, both because of the labor's demands and because words are conserved in the growing heat. From a distance, the figures on the salt pan look like small moving shadows against a pale sea. When a sufficient number of blocks has been cut, the camels are brought forward. Each animal is loaded with bundles of saltiform, 20 to 30 blocks per camel, carefully balanced to prevent strain. The camels groan not from protest but from habit, their long necks swaying as they are led away from the glaring salt surface and onto the rocky paths leading north and west. The destination might be a market town in the Ethiopian highlands, where salt will be traded for grain, cloth, or tools. In older times, the salt might travel even farther, into Sudan or along Red Sea trade routes. Salt from the Afar Depression had value beyond taste. In highland Ethiopia, it was considered essential for livestock health and food preservation. Traders, warriors, and even religious leaders accepted a mo as payment for goods or services. The blocks were standardized enough in shape and weight that they could be counted and valued much like coins, and in some places they held more stability than minted currency during times of political upheaval. The journey from the salt pans to the markets was as much a part of the trade as the cutting put itself. Caravans could stretch for hundreds of animals, their bells chiming softly in the dry wind. Paths wound through volcanic plateaus, past hot springs, and over escarpments where the air grew cooler with each step upward. Banditry was a risk, though. In most cases, local alliances and trade agreements offered some measure of protection. To walk alongside such a caravan was to witness a moving tradition, one that looked almost identical in the 18th century as it did in the 12th or even earlier. The pace was slow, dictated by the camel's endurance and the need to rest during the heat of midday. Nights were spent in small encampments where fires were lit, salt bundles covered against the dew, and stories shared under the stars. Even the markets themselves bore the imprint of this trade. In towns like Mekelle or Berahil, designated salt quarters existed where traders gathered to negotiate prices, inspect the clarity and weight of blocks, and arrange onward transport. Here, A mole might be exchanged for silver coins, but just as often they were swapped directly for goods. The rhythms of these exchanges testing a block with a quick strike of a knife, stacking them into carts, haggling over bundles were as much a part of Ethiopian life as the ringing of church bells or the call to prayer. What made this trade particularly enduring was its deep embedding in multiple systems at once: economic, social, and even ceremonial. Clay salt blocks were given as part of marriage arrangements, offered in tribute to rulers, and donated to religious institutions. To give salt was to acknowledge its role in life itself, preserving food, sustaining bodies, and binding communities through shared necessity. And yet, for all its centrality, the life of a salt trader or cutter was not one of wealth. The profits, especially for those who harvested, were slim. Wealth concentrated among merchants who controlled the long-distance routes, or who had established rights to the most productive pans. Still, the work persisted, generation after generation, because it was a foundation that did not shift easily. Empires rose and fell, roads were built and abandoned, but the white horizon of the salt pans remained. Standing at the edge of that horizon in the morning light, you might wonder how many amol blocks lay stacked in the highland markets at this very moment, and how many journeys they had taken to get there. You might ask yourself whether the men who cut these blocks thought of their final destinations, or whether the work was simply the day's task, the same as yesterday and the same as tomorrow. If the salt pans of the Afar Depression were the white foundation of the trade, the road to the highlands was its beating pulsar path, as constant as the wind and as measured as the pace of a camel's gait. This route was not a single road, but rather a network of well-worn trails, some carved by the passage of countless caravans, others following ancient footpaths used by pastoralists and traders, long before written records marked their existence. Leaving the salt flats meant an immediate change in color and texture underfoot. The bright, glaring surface gave way to cracked earth, strewn with black volcanic rock that seemed to absorb the heat and radiate it back upward. Here the pace slowed. The camels, already loaded with 20 to 30 amale each, needed steady footing, and the men walking alongside them used long sticks to probe the ground ahead. A stumble could crack a salt block, reducing its value. The air itself seemed to change with each kilometer gained in elevation. From the salty dryness of the depression floor, the caravan gradually entered zones where faint scents of acacia and wild sage drifted on the breeze. These transitions were small and gradual, and for traders who made the journey many times a year, each plant, each bend in the road, was like a familiar marker on a long, slow clock. Caravans often traveled in groups, not only for security, but for the efficiency of shared labor. In the hottest parts of the journey, animals and men rested during midday under improvised shelters of cloth or branches. Watering holes, some natural, others improved by human hands, were spaced strategically along the route. Control of these water points was a form of power. Local clans could grant or deny access, and in times of conflict, a denied watering hole could mean the collapse of a trade mission. It was in these resting spots that the social life of the caravan emerged. Traders from different regions exchanged news, not just about markets and prices, but about births, marriages, disputes, and political shifts. A caravan was not merely an economic unit, it was a moving hub of information. A ruler in the highlands might learn of a distant rebellion from a salt trader long before a messenger could arrive by horse. One particularly important node in this network was the market town of Beira. Perched at the edge of the depression, it was a place of transitions. Salt was weighed, inspected, and sometimes rebundled for the climb into the highlands. Here, desert dwellers met highland merchants, each eyeing the other's wares with the quiet calculation of people who understood the thin margins of trade. Beryl also functioned as a point where news was distilled. Traders descending into the depression heard of changing prices or political troubles above. Those ascending were warned of droughts, bandit activity, or disputes over salt rights. From Beira Hill, the road climbed steadily into cooler air. The camels, so well suited to the heat of the depression, sometimes struggled with the steeper inclines. Highland traders often brought mules or donkeys to take on part of the load in these sections. The higher paths were lined with terraces, barley and teff, and the caravan's arrival in a village was met with quiet curiosity from children, who sometimes followed for a stretch before being called back by parents. As the road rose, so too did the value of the salt. In the highlands, far from the pans, amo were more than a commodity. They were a store of wealth and a symbol of connectivity to distant lands. Merchants might hold on to them as savings, trading them only when other resources ran low. In some cases, they were used to pay soldiers or civil servants, particularly in regions where minted currency was scarce. Markets in the highlands, such as Mekelle, buzzed with a kind of slow intensity on salt days. Merchants arranged their ammo in neat stacks, the uniformity of shape giving the market a geometric beauty. Buyers tested the quality by chipping an edge, noting the whiteness and compactness of the crystal. Haggling was rarely heated. Instead, it was an unhurried exchange, with pauses for sips of spiced coffee or bites of flatbread. The salt might then be traded for woven cloth, coffee beans, iron tools, or even gold dust. In some cases, it continued its journey, passing into the hands of long-distance merchants bound for Sudanese towns or the Red Sea ports. Thus, a block of salt cut in the pale glare of the Afar Depression might end up on a table in a city hundreds of kilometers away, perhaps to be used in curing meat for a feast, or preserving cheese for a long voyage. For the men and animals of the caravan, the market was both an end and a pause. Goods were exchanged, animals rested, and preparations began for the journey back. The return was not without its own burdens. In the highlands, traders often loaded the camels with grain, coffee, or textiles to take back down into the depression. Thus, the road never truly emptied, it pulsed in both directions, a living artery between two different worlds. And always, behind the movement of goods, there was the unbroken rhythm of the seasons. Rainfall in the highlands could make paths muddy and treacherous. The dry season in the depression could bring dust storms that scoured skin and eyes. But the trade endured, not because it was easy, but because it was dependable in a way few other resources were. Salt did not spoil. It did not rot. It could be stored for years and still hold its value. A quiet certainty in a landscape of constant change. Some historians suggest that the endurance of this salt trade was as much cultural as it was economic. The act of cutting, loading, carrying, and trading amele became a tradition in itself, a profession passed down within families, not because it made fortunes, but because it linked generations to a shared history. Every trader could trace his work back through fathers and grandfathers to an ancestor who first took a camel onto the white flats and struck the ground with an iron bar. That one can imagine, standing in a highland market and watching the slow barter over stacks of salt, that the story of this trade is not only about what was moved, but about the patience required to move it. Salt was heavy. The road was long. And yet, both were constants in a region where rivers could shift course and borders could be redrawn with the next war. What, then, kept men walking this road year after year, generation after generation? Was it purely the weight of necessity? Or was there a quieter satisfaction in knowing that the work was part of something older than any single lifer road that once entered could carry you across both distance and time? If the cutting of the salt in the Afar Depression was the opening act, and the long road to the highlands the central passage, then the legacy of the Amele is the final chapter, one that does not end with the arrival in the market, but lingers, in how these pale rectangular slabs continued to shape societies long after the caravans dispersed. In many ways, the story of Amol is a study in slow transformation. Long before coins of silver or copper entered the region, salt served as currency, tangible, divisible, and universally valued. The Amol, unlike the coins of empires, carried no stamped image, no face of a ruler. Instead, its authority lay in its shape and purity. A standard Amol might measure around 30 centimeters in length, weigh a few kilograms, and bear the even, pale surface that spoke of its origin in the brilliant white pans far below sea level. For highland communities, owning Amol was as much about security as wealth. They could be stored indefinitely, stacked neatly in storerooms, or buried discreetly for safekeeping. Unlike grain, they did not risk infestation. Unlike cloth, they did not fade or fray. A family might pass a mole from one generation to the next, their edges gradually chipped as they were broken down to pay for taxes, livestock, or dowries. The quiet accumulation of salt could be a sign of prudence. While its careful dispersal marked life's major events, the state, too, had its role in the life of the Amel. In the medieval Ethiopian kingdom, rulers recognized that controlling the salt trade meant controlling a steady stream of wealth. Some levied taxes directly on the caravans. Others established guarded routes or provided escorts in exchange for a portion of the goods. The salt trade thus became intertwined with governance. A king who ensured the safety of the salt road was ensuring the smooth beating of an economic heart. Yet the significance of the Amole extended beyond economics. In oral traditions, salt was sometimes used as a metaphor for loyalty or endurance. Proverbs likened steadfast friendship to a store of salt unshaken, essential and quietly binding. In songs sung by caravan men, the Amale appeared not only as an object of labor, but as a companion in the journey, a presence that connected desert heat to highland cool, isolation to community. By the time foreign travelers began documenting Ethiopia's salt trade in the 19th century, they were struck not only by the endurance of the practice, but by its resistance to replacement. Even as minted coins entered circulation, Amale retained their role in local markets, especially in rural areas. A trader might accept silver coins from a foreigner, but turn to salt for everyday exchange with neighbors. This dual economy, one measured in metal, the other in mineral, created a layered marketplace, where value was negotiated as much by tradition as by weight. The persistence of the Amale was aided by the simple fact that the salt pans could not be relocated. They remained a fixed resource, requiring the same labor, the same journey, the same patient animals and men. Caravans continued to form, the long lines of camels weaving like quiet threads between the desert and the hills. For the people of Afar Depression, cutting salt remained a livelihood, and for the Highlanders, its arrival was as expected as the change of seasons. However, the 20th century brought changes that would slowly erode the primacy of the Amol. Roads built for trucks and buses began to bypass the slow caravans, and mechanized mining introduced the possibility of extracting and transporting salt on a scale no camel train could match. Markets shifted toward cash, and in urban centers, salt became a commodity sold by weight rather than as standardized blocks. Still, in some regions, the old ways persisted, and amold retained symbolic importance in rituals or as heirlooms. Today, in parts of the Afar region, you can still see caravans, though fewer than in centuries past, moving across the pale flats. The cutting tools remain simple, the loading method unchanged. Some of these caravans exist as much for heritage as for necessity, a living reminder of the human patience and endurance that shaped the trade. In reflecting on the story of the Amol, one can't help but see it as a quiet form of connection, binding together people separated by geography, climate, and way of life. By the men of the Depression, accustomed to heat and glare, relied on the cool green markets of the highlands for trade. The farmers of the uplands depended on the unbroken white horizon of the pans for their store of wealth. Each was incomplete without the other. And perhaps this is why the Salt Road endured so long. It was more than a supply chain. It was a shared rhythm, a seasonal migration of both goods and stories. The journey of a single mole was also the journey of trust between communities, the unspoken agreement that what was carried out of the earth in one place could hold value in another, far away, even now. The idea of walking beside a caravan in the quiet hours before dawn, hearing only the pad of hooves, the soft clink of salt against salt of oaks, a sense of belonging to something older than nations. To hold an amelie in your hands is to hold a piece of that continuity, a weight not only of mineral, but of memory. And if we were to stand, just for a moment, on the salt pans at sunrise, watching the first strike of the iron bar into the white crust, we might ask ourselves, in a world that moves so quickly, what quiet trades are we in danger of forgetting, and what will be lost when they are gone? The Tea-Horse Road of Yunnan. The Tea-Horse Road was never a single road in the way that a straight Roman causeway or a French king's highway might be. It was a network, a slow braid of mountain trails stretching across the borderlands of southwest China, Tibet, and beyond, connecting lush tea-growing valleys with high, windswept plateaus. If you imagine it from above, you wouldn't see a ribbon of stone, but a scatter of paths, converging and parting again like tributaries feeding into a river. Its origins lie in necessity, two regions each possessing what the other lacked. In the low, misty hills of Yunnan, tea grew thick and abundant, a leaf with the power to warm, revive, and flavor. In the high Tibetan plateau, tea could not grow at all. But sturdy horses, thrived animals, bred for strength, endurance, and in thin air. The bargain was as simple as it was enduring. Tea for horses. Your journey would begin in Yunnan's tea country, where terraces stepped down the slopes like green staircases, each rung lined with the small, dark leaves of camellia sensate. The air here was heavy with the sweet, slightly bitter scent of fresh tea, especially in spring when the first flush was picked. Villages nestled between folds in the land, their wooden houses dark with age, their courtyards hung with bamboo, trays where leaves wilted before firing. The preparation of tea for trade was itself a measured, almost meditative process. After picking, leaves were heated in large woks to halt oxidation, rolled to break down the cells, then pressed into dense, round cakes or elongated bricks. Pressing tea had practical advantages. The bricks were easier to pack, resisted damage, on the road, and kept their flavor for years. In some workshops, wooden molds bore stamped patterns, a mark of origin or quality, not unlike a seal on parchment. When the tea was ready, the caravans formed. This was no small matter. Each journey meant months away from home, traversing mountain passes that could be snow-choked even in midsummer. Muleteers selected their animals carefully. Mules were preferred for many stretches, their balance and endurance outmatching horses in steep terrain. Horses themselves, ironically, were often not part of the tea caravan. They would be obtained in trade at the far end of the route. The loading ritual was slow and deliberate. Tea bricks were wrapped in bamboo or palm leaves, tied into bundles, panned, and lashed to wooden pack frames. Each mule could carry about 60 kilograms balanced evenly to avoid strain. The mule leaders often loaded their animals in the quiet of early morning, the soundscape consisting mostly of low voices, the soft clink of ropes and buckles, and the shuffling of hooves. Once on the trail, progress was steady but never hurried. The tea horse road wound through landscapes of remarkable variety, humid valleys heavy with orchids and moss, sharp ridgelines where wind scoured the stones, river gorges where suspension bridges of woven bamboo swayed above churning water. In some places, the path was so narrow that only one animal could pass at a time. In others, the trail opened onto broad meadows grazed by YAKS. Life on the road had its patterns. Caravans typically traveled early in the morning and late in the afternoon, resting during the hottest hours. Nights were spent in caravanserais, simple inns, often just wooden buildings, with an open yard for the animals. These stops served as hubs where news traveled faster than the caravans themselves, who had crossed the pass, where the river was high, whether a village's store of barley was plentiful or lean. The tea was not simply an object of trade. Along the way, muleteers, villagers, and monks drank it, daily strong, often salted or mixed with butter in Tibetan fashion. For the highland peoples, tea was more than a drink. It was part of survival, supplying warmth, hydration, and, in the case, butter tea, calories. Without the tea horse road, the plateau would have been a colder, more austere place. The exchange point between tea and horses was often a bustling seasonal market, perhaps in a Tibetan town where the trail widened into an open square. Here, lowland tea traders met highland horse breeders. Bargaining could last for days, conducted over bowls of steaming tea, salted and churned with butter until it resembled a thick, briny soup. The measure of a deal was not only in weight and number, but in trust. Relationships built over years could determine whether a trader got the best horses or the freshest tea. Yet the journey was rarely without difficulty. Landslides could block a trail for weeks. A sudden snowstorm could trap a caravan high on a pass, forcing them to huddle in makeshift shelters. In some stretches, banditry was a risk, though muleteers often traveled in groups large enough to deter opportunists. The steady plod of hooves might seem peaceful, but each step carried the weight of uncertainty. Over centuries, the tea-horse road became more than an economic exchange. It became a cultural artery. Along its length, you would hear at least 3, or, for languages, see temples blending Han and Tibetan designs. Taste foods that combined ingredients from valleys and plateaus alike. Monks carried sacred texts one way. Artisans carried lacquerware, wool, and herbal medicines the other. standing at a vantage point where you could see a caravan threading along a mountainside, a line of small, moving dots. It was easy to imagine that the road had no end, only a continual weaving of paths and purposes. For those who walked it year after year, the Tea-Horse Road was not an adventure, but a livelihood, a slow and careful link between two worlds. Still, one might ask, what happened to all those tea bricks after they left the caravan's side and disappeared into the smoke-filled tents of the plateau? If Section 1 was the starting breath of the journey, Section 2 is the long exhaled, the miles that stretch between departure and arrival, where the Tea-Horse Road reveals its stubborn, winding character. Leaving the lower slopes of Yunnan, you would notice the air thinning, the clouds lowering, and the vegetation shifting. The damp fragrance of tea plantations gave way to the resinous scent of pine and juniper, and then to the sparse, dry smell of alpine grass. Here, the caravans walked more slowly, not from fatigue alone, but from caution. The mountain passes were both gateways and gauntlets, beautiful in their openness, but capable of closing in an instant. The passes had names as old as the road itself, each carrying its own stories. Some told of muleteers who lost their footing and tumbled into gorges. Others told of miraculous crossings where a blizzard parted or a swollen river froze just long enough for the caravan to pass. Superstition was not separate from daily life. Before attempting a high pass, caravan leaders might burn juniper branches, letting the fragrant smoke curl upward as an offering to the mountain spirit. A few muttered short chants, a mix of Buddhist sutras and local folk prayers, before giving the signal to move on. When climbing a pass, the animals set the pace. Mules picked their way along rocky ledges, hooves clinking against stone, nostrils flaring in the cold air. Muleteers wore thick wool coats, patched in a dozen places, and carried staffs, not just for balance, but for signaling. Sharp tap on a rock might urge the line forward. A raised hand could halt it. The rhythm of these crossings was almost step, step, pause, breathed out at night in the highlands. The stars were a bright, endless spill overhead, but the cold was a constant, pressing presence. Caravanserais here were built low and tight to conserve heat, with central hearths and low wooden platforms for sleeping. In many of these stops, tea from the caravan's own cargo would be brewed not to sample the profit, but to preserve the body, bitter, smoky, and thickened with butter and salt. It restored the energy spent on the day's climb. The midpoints of the Tea-Horse Road often coincided with market towns that swelled and shrank with the seasons. One such town might see its population double for a few weeks each spring and autumn, as caravans from the lowlands arrived with tea, cloth, and grain, while highland traders brought horses, salt, medicinal herbs, and wool. The marketplace was rarely quiet. The soundscape was a mix of braying animals, clattering hooves, haggling voices, and the steady thud of mallets repairing pack frames. In these markets, a single tea brick could be measured not in currency, but in the number of days it might sustain. Per a family. For Tibetan traders, the arrival of tea was as vital as the arrival of barley flour. Here one could see the barter system in its purest form. 10 tea bricks might buy a horse. Bundle of medicinal rhubarb roots might fetch enough tea to last a season. You might imagine these exchanges as straightforward, but negotiations were intricate dances. Traders evaluated the tightness of a tea brick's pressing, the clarity of its stamp, the sharpness or softness of its aroma. Horse breeders assessed not just the animal's appearance, but its endurance. Some horses were led around the market yard, their gait and temperament judged before a deal was struck. Trust played as big a role as the goods themselves. Many caravan leaders returned to the same trading partners year after year, sealing agreements with shared meals and small gifts beyond the markets. The return journey began this time with horses in tow. Horses could not be packed like tea bricks. They required grazing, watering, and constant care. Caravans returning with horses often moved more slowly, allowing for rest and feeding along the way. Muleteers, who had come to the plateau with loads of tea, now became horse handlers, their calls and whistles replacing the clink of tea frames. The road's dangers did not end once trade was completed. Horses were valuable targets for theft, and certain stretches of the trail were known for opportunistic bandit attacks. To guard against this, caravans sometimes hired extra hands for the return trip men, who carried long staffs or simple swords, their presence often more deterrent than defense. There were also the unpredictable natural interruptions, rivers swollen by glacial melt, forcing days of waiting for the waters to drop, sudden fogs that could erase the trail, turning familiar paths into uncertain ones. In such moments, caravan life became a test of patience. The measure of a good leader was not speed, but the ability to keep both men and animals calm when the world refused to move forward culturally. These journeys left traces in both regions. Lowland villages along the route incorporated elements of Tibetan dress-heavy wool cloaks, patterned belts, silver ornaments, while highland markets adopted the flavors of Yunnan tea in their daily life. Songs carried along the route told of crossings, bargains, and the camaraderie of the road. Some verses were purely practical mnemonics for the order of villages along the way, while others drifted into wistful tales of home, loved ones, and the promise of returning after many moons. By the time the caravan was back in the tea hills of Yunnan, months might have passed. The same terraces that had been mist-shrouded at departure might now be bright with autumn sun or resting under winter frost. Families reunited, pack frames were repaired, and plans for the next journey began almost immediately. For while the tea horse road was a challenge, it was also a lifeline, one that neither tea grower nor horse breeder could afford to let fall silent. Yet the deeper question remains: how did this network of paths, so rugged, so dependent on human endurance, for centuries in the face of wars, shifting borders, and the slow arrival of modern roads, By the dawn of the 20th century, the Tea-Horse Road was still breathing, but its pulse was slower. The rhythms of caravans, once as predictable as the seasons, began to shift, stretched thin by the arrival of railways and motor roads in neighboring provinces. The mountains still stood, the tea still grew, but the nature of the journey was changing. Some say the road began to fade, not with the first train, but with the first reliable telegraph. Communication could leap over mountains now, without the trudging pace of mules or the careful plodding of horses. Orders for tea could be made from a city desk, not a highland tent. Yet, for a time, both systems coexisted. Messages flew by, but the tea itself still moved along the old paths. For the muleteers, these were years of adjustment. Some continued their seasonal treks, adding freight for modern goods, kerosene matches, machine parts alongside tea. Others shifted to shorter routes, ferrying goods from rail depots to market towns unreachable by train. The caravans became smaller, the trips less frequent, but the rituals remained much the same. The burning of juniper at passes, the bargaining in highland markets, the careful feeding of animals. What truly began to erode the road was the growing web of routes into Yunnan's interior. Trucks could carry more tea in a day than a caravan in a month. A journey that once took 6 weeks could now be compressed into a fraction of that time, bypassing the chain of inns, markets, and passes that had given the Tea-Horse Road its lifeblood. And yet parts of the old road endured, put in villages too remote for engines. Mules still traced the same narrow ledges, their hoofprints falling in the same shallow hollows carved by centuries of predecessors. Some caravanserais found new life as guest houses, their old hearths now warming travelers with modern rucksacks instead of muleteers. The cultural memory of the Tea-Horse Road lingered stubbornly. In Lijiang, Shaxi, and other market towns, festivals still reenacted the old exchanges. Tea bricks and miniature pack saddles appeared in parades, carried not by mules but by school children in borrowed wool cloaks. Old caravan songs were revived, not because they were needed for navigation, but because they carried the cadence of a shared past. In the Tibetan plateau, the road's echo could be tasted in every cup of butter tea. Elders remembered when the arrival of the first tea caravan after winter was an event worth marking, its smoky aroma curling into homes like the promise of spring. Some even claimed they could tell the origin of a brick, whether it came from the eastern hills or the southern slopes, by taste alone. There is a quiet irony in how the road has survived, not as a dominant artery of trade, but as a thread woven into identity. Tourism brochures now speak of the ancient Tea-Horse Road in the same breath as the Silk Road, offering guided treks and photo opportunities where once there were only necessity and endurance. Mules still walk some of those paths, but now their loads are often camping gear, water bottles, and camera tripods. For the historian, the Tea-Horse Road offers something unusual, a long-lived trade route that was neither vast empire nor purely local track, but a stubborn middle ground. It did not seek to conquer territory or broadcast imperial power. Its purpose was practical, reciprocal, and enduring tea. For horses, lowlands for highlands, and a rhythm of movement that ignored borders more often than it acknowledged them, and prosove, stretch of the road to Daysay. A moss-covered stone path in a quiet Yunnan valley are not just stepping where caravans once passed. You are stepping into a slow conversation between landscapes and livelihoods, one that lasted far longer than many of the dynasties that tried to chart it on their maps. The mules and horses that once carried its burdens are long gone, their hoofbeat replaced by the crunch of hiking boots or the distant hum of a motorcycle on a parallel road. Yet if you listen closely on a windless day, you might still catch the imagined cadence of step, step, pause. Breathe the reminder that history, even in its most boring details, often leaves the deepest imprints, not in monuments, but in the quiet persistence of use. Perhaps the last question worth asking is this: when a road no longer carries the trade it was built for, does it truly end, or does it simply change its purpose, becoming a path for memory instead of goods?